My Lords, it's a great pleasure to follow the noble lady Baroness Lister at Butterset and agree with everything that she just said. I rise to offer Green support for Clause 1, not stand part, to which we would have attached a signature had there been space. And I'm well aware we've already had a very long debate, so I want to make three key points that I think have not quite been made elsewhere, although I do also want to echo the point made by the noble Lord Wallace in introducing this group about the power of the noble Lord Woolley's speech last week. And anyone who wants to see it, you'll find it on my Twitter account, handily captioned and shared, and I'd urge people to share it because I do think it deserves a very wide audience. But the first of my 3 points, and it builds on the point from the noble Baroness Lady Fox, who suggested that people were saying, oh, there might be a sinister plot with the Republicans. Well, there doesn't have to be a sinister plot for people to be copying what they're seeing happening in other parts of the world. And indeed, I think the inspiration for this for voter ID, which I believe is voter suppression, comes from the other side of the pond. And I'm going to quote the American Civil Liberties Union because I think it's instructive, if that's where the inspiration is coming from, to see the context where that inspiration comes from. So the American Civil Liberties Union says voting should be as easy and accessible as possible, but more than 400 anti-voter bills have been introduced in 48 states. The result is a severely compromised democracy that doesn't reflect the will of the people. Our democracy works best when all eligible voters can participate and have their voices heard. Now, that's a message from America, but I believe that's a message that we should also be listening to here. And I think if we look at the context of this, and indeed the comments...
I just intervene to ask a question. Does she not understand that voting systems in the US are a state matter? And the problem is not what she's saying, it's the problem every state has a different methodology. And that's what leads to confusion and difficulties, particularly in some states which adopt particularly regressive and repressive measures. The point she's making about voter ID is nothing to do with that.
Well, I disagree with the noble lord in the sense that what I'm talking about is the rhetoric and the context and the reason behind this, and whether it's happening on a state-by-state basis or on a national basis. What's behind this is indeed the second quote that I was going to come to, which is from Max Feldman at the Brennan Centre for Justice, who says that claims of widespread fraud are nothing more than old wine in new bottles. President Trump and his allies have long claimed without evidence that different aspects of our elections are infected with voter fraud. Before mail voting, they pushed similar false narratives about non-citizen voting, voter impersonation and double voting. And picking up the point from the noble lord about people's concerns about the voting system, of course we do see these days with social media a great deal of sharing and cross-fertilisation of concerns. And rhetoric being spread by very powerful, well-funded forces will, of course, have an impact on people's views, as we have indeed seen in other contexts. So I think the noble lady Baroness Noakes suggested people were coming perilously close to suggesting that the purpose behind this voter ID was voter suppression. I'm not going to come perilously close to it. I'm going to say that I believe that is the case. The second point I want to make is a historical one in terms of what's happened over history. Now, I don't believe that we're on a gradual progress of positively guaranteed going better into the future. But if we look at the trends, 1832, 1867, the Great Reform Acts spreading the right to vote among men, 1918, 1928, women getting the right to vote, 1969, implemented in 1970, the voting age reduced from 21 to 18. There's all heading in the direction of greater engagement. And we saw earlier in oral questions some fairly severe attacks on democracy and devolution in the UK. But of Scotland and Wales, of course, have gone further down this road with votes at 16. So democracy has been on a long-term trend of engaging more people. And I think we have to ask a question of why are we suddenly heading in the opposite direction with voter ID. And the final point I want to make is a practical one, because most of the discussion here has focused on the estimated 2 million people who don't have the ID. But I don't think we've talked enough about the people who don't have the ID on them at the point where they're going to vote. And I draw from this, and the noble lady Baroness Lister pointed out that none of the pilots were in large urban areas. Well, I was actually in a large urban area, Sheffield, telling on a polling station in one of the years when the pilots were being conducted. And I saw a large number of people who'd seen the reports and thought that they'd have to have ID. I saw... Yes?
Thank you, noble Baroness. Citing where the pilots took place, and I noticed earlier on that Lord Adonis didn't seem to be aware that pilots had actually taken place. But was it not the case that local councils, a number of them, actually refused to participate in the pilots, and therefore it isn't a case of those places that were chosen by the government, it was those places that were allowed to by the local authorities?
Respectfully responds the noble lords that whether it was the choice of the local authorities or not, that harms the quality of the evidence that we have before us.
Where the pilots have taken place, but the pilots aren't nearly proportionate to the scale of the reform that's being introduced. We don't know anything about the likely scale of their impact on voter turnout and all the administrative issues that are going to be raised by introducing this as a nationwide reform for these very small and selective pilots which were taking place, which weren't even in representative areas. So I think the issue of piloting is still very much there, and there should, if this is going to be introduced as a nationwide reform, there should be many constituencies. Because often we're talking about parliamentary elections, my lords. There should be many constituencies where this is piloted before we move in this direction.
This hasn't been piloted before a general election, and the Electoral Commission specifically says that there should be a pilot before it's rolled out for a general election.
A fundamental point. They were piloted in local elections. So the scale of the pilot, the scale of the pilots, this is intervention on intervention, the scale of the pilots, my lords, hasn't been nearly proportionate to the scale of the reform which is proposed to be introduced in this case.
I thank both of the noble lords who've contributed greatly to the argument that I made. And coming back to this, the question of people who don't own the voter ID but don't happen to have it on them, and the experience of Sheffield this particular occasion. And one of the people I spoke to was a man who came speed walking up to me, puffing slightly, and said, "Oh, have I got to have voter ID?" And I said, No, it's all right, you don't need it here. And he said, "OK," and dashed into the polling station. Now, I have absolutely no doubt that if I'd been forced to say yes to that man, he was obviously having a very busy day, as many of us do, with 2 or 3 jobs people have to maintain to put food on the table, keep a roof over their head, people with caring responsibilities, the fact that we have voting on a Thursday's a working day for very many people, all of the reasons why voting can be difficult for people to access. Maybe there's a little window opened up in your day. You're a care worker who moves between different houses, and suddenly you've got a little opportunity to go past the polling station, but you haven't got your passport on you. Or you're a student, and you live at home and you perhaps leave your passport at home with your parents for safekeeping because you don't travel overseas very often, and you go to vote where your student residence is. Have you remembered from 2 months ago that there was an election coming? Maybe you didn't even know there was an election coming. 2 months ago you left your passport at home. So I think we haven't looked enough at the fact that it's not just people who don't own this ID. It's the question that people do not have to, and I think the noble lady Baroness Lister made the very powerful point that the European case studies do not match up. Because, of course, if you live in a country where a police officer or other official can stop you at any time and say, "Where's your ID?" you will always have your ID on you. That's not the case in the UK. So I just want to come to one concluding point, which covers this group of amendments and many others. A lot of this bill and the direction of the government is suggesting that we have a problem with the voters of the UK. I don't think we have any problem with the voters. We have huge problems with our failed political system.